Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing The Normal and the Pathological by George Canguilhem, a French philosopher and medical doctor. So, I need to, before we start this video, to preface it by two things. A, I am no medical doctor, so my expertise isn't in that. And secondly, I am not a philosopher, so this understanding of this book is at my level, right? It's my understanding of it and it's my experience that I'm sharing. I just need to make it very clear. Because in this book, Canguilhem is going to fundamentally explain what is the normal and what is pathological. His aim here is to try and define the two terms, which, as we're going to see throughout this video, is quite an immense feat. And he does that through the prism of medicine, meaning that what he's going to be interested in is what is normal and what is abnormal. But, and this is important, in medicine, normality goes with the concept of health. So therefore, is what is healthy normal? And what is pathological? Is it illness? And so he's going to basically try and think about those two concepts throughout the whole book. And the book is very interesting and it's very explicit with its medical knowledge. Therefore, I personally, because I'm not a medical doctor, struggled to understand all the examples. But the idea fundamentally that he's trying to bring, Canguilhem brings to the table, is that it's not that easy to qualify what is normal and what is not. Because at the very core, when we think of medicine, what is normal or what is healthy? What is it? Where's the delineation point? Where's the breaking off point from what is normal and what is pathological? How do we measure it? How do we think about it? How do we even conceive of it? And he explains throughout this book that basically our ideas on what is normal have evolved with society, that medicine itself has evolved, that we went through the early ages of mankind of thinking of illness as a curse or as a spell that was brought upon us, to nowadays a more modern perspective in which we believe, or we know, that it's more about metrics and about fundamental lines that we have basically explored through the act of science. But where Canguilhem is going to be interesting is that for him, medicine isn't a science. Not that it is unobjective or it is subjective, but there is what he opposes the fundamental idea that medicine is merely an objective art form. For him, what is first and foremost is what he calls clinical, meaning that it's about the examination between a professional and the patient. And his whole premise is this idea that however we try and qualify the normal, something is always going to be amiss, because fundamentally there is a confusion. First and foremost, this confusion is led by the term itself, because you might know this, but normal comes from norma in Latin, which is basically the set square, right? Which is an instrument, meaning that everything that does not fit in the set square isn't normal. So here we already have the problem that normality is intrinsically linked to normativity, meaning that it has to be the same. And what this is going to brilliantly point out is that if you're ever going to do that, it's going to create problems, because if everyone had to be the same, then there would be no variation. And for Canguilhem, variation is not just a spice of life, it is basically a fundamental advantageous nature of life, that life needs diversity, and he's very, very adamant about this, that it isn't just about right and wrong, good or bad, or life and death. It's not like switching a switch. The normal and the pathological are basically scales, and to say that variation is bad implies something that he feels is fundamentally wrong. It implies that there's basically an ideal, and he's going to be very critical about this, that there is in medicine no ideal, that health is seems ideal, but the problem is that a healthy individual is always an individual within a certain system or within a certain environment or milieu, meaning that at the core, at the crux, an healthy individual by themselves don't exist. He's also very interestingly enough going to explain that health is something that is somewhat of a construct, because at the very core, for example, what we consider normal, i.e. being healthy, is it really normal? What I mean by that, and what he means by that, is that it would seem to us completely abnormal or bizarre that someone could not fall sick. Yet it is the ideal of medicine that someone might never fall sick. So how Canguilhem resolves this issue is through a very interesting perspective. He says that, and this is something that I always found very brilliant, this sentence, that health or normality is the ability for the given man to be able to fall sick and then to rise again. In a way, what has to happen is that for him, the illness, the pathology, creates a moment where the individual has to redefine themselves, because they're going to be disabled, because they're going to have a chronic illness, because they're going to have limitations. The state before is no longer achievable or no longer reachable in most cases. So therefore something has to be recreated, a new norm. And this is where the real brilliance comes in, is that for Canguilhem, what is normal is fundamentally the identity or basically the standards we give ourselves, so that we create that standard. Like, for example, if tomorrow someone becomes disabled, right? Let's say tetraplegia, right? Can't move, can't use their hands and feet and legs and so on and so forth. There's no going back to what used to be the case, right? The state of before is over. What we would all consider to be the primary state is gone. But that person can create new normalities, new habits, and can, through the act of adaptation and adaptations that are given to the person, create an environment in which they have a new normal. And this is very interesting and very important, because we go from something that becomes medical, of this is right, this is wrong, to a whole spectrum of behaviors in which what is as important as the medical diagnosis is the subjectivity, the phenomenology of the individual suffering from the pathology. And this might seem very obvious to you, but you have to understand that in medicine it was not necessarily the case, because medicine is very invested in this idea of the objective, of something that is universal, true in all possible worlds kind of stuff. There's really this aim at trying to find something that does not belong in the subjective. But, and this is where Canguilhem brings back this idea of subjective, is that illness is also defined by the patient, and it's primarily defined by the patient. It's because we have an illness that we go and see a doctor. It's because we're feeling unwell, because something is wrong, because something is conflicting with what we feel are our basic standards. And that conflictuality brings us to the doctor. Therefore, what we observed in ourselves is primary to the doctor and their theoretical knowledge. And this is also true in psychology, right? Because even though he doesn't talk too much about psychology, he does mention it, explaining that fundamentally there might be states that are considered normal or abnormal, but they always inform the circumstances and the situation. And in psychology, it's the same kind of vibe, that fundamentally the person is suffering. That's why they come to us, and that's why they want treatments, because there's an innate form of suffering. And this is the same in medicine. And in this perspective, what happens is that the pathology is suffering. And this is what medicine is trying to basically solve. It's this question of suffering. However, as it tries to attempt to solve it, it creates another problem in the idea of normality, because it then becomes what is not pathological is normal. And this is not accurate. For Canguilhem, what is happening there is that it's a simplification, a right and wrong switch kind of situation of on and off. What is the reality is that an individual is normal through their own standards, but also upon basically points in their life. Like, for example, the normal of, let's say, your 20s isn't going to be the normal of your 80s. And even us, we're going to shift. Like, for example, what we consider normal, for example, for a young man to be able to do, will be completely abnormal for an 80-year-old to do, and vice versa. Of course, there's always exceptions, and he points them out, but the idea that we stay at a constant in our lives is wrong. And this idea of a universal norm is also wrong, in the fact that every individual might be ever slightly different, but that doesn't mean it is quote-unquote pathological. And then he brings in this very interesting point of anomalies. In life there are anomalies, things that are, how can I say, not standard, but are not, and this is interesting, illness. Things like, for example, dextrocardia, and he talks about it, for example, dextrocardia being that the heart is not on the left like most people, but on the right. And fundamentally he says that's not pathological, not really, and it's just a difference. And that difference is something to be understood on the lens of, for the individual, it is normal, but for the whole collective, it is an anomaly. And he also, later in the text, goes into this very interesting point that we might also consider what is pathological as errors, like, for example, errors in genetics, errors in mutations. But he says that there's also a major problem with that, because if you consider it errors, that means you're implicitly creating a system of values in which you implicitly or explicitly basically create a dichotomy in which some people have errors, are errors of nature, and some others are not. They are the standard, they are the ideal. And by doing so, you are creating the risk of basically a eugenic perspective, which is fundamentally a risk of genetics. And he points it out. And he points it out in the 60s. So it's something that was very contemporary at the time. He also points out that medicine itself is not free from the whole discourse of society, that society and its influences, its ideas, basically fertilize medicine to see things in a certain perspective, that it isn't just about right or wrong, that is a very nuanced point. He also adds to the fact that what we consider normal in our day and age is also laws that are there to regulate us, and, interestingly enough, production, that we standardize everything to be able to produce faster. So there's a whole capitalistic aspect to this as well, in the idea of norms itself, where it becomes almost exclusionary and rejecting in the idea of having norms. And when it comes to medicine, there's this tentative to try and make massive categories of pathological and normality. But the truth is that there is no real cut-off point, as I was saying earlier, no easy way to just say this is exactly pathological and this is exactly normal. It isn't really like that. They're more of a priori, because they're also about the medium man, right? Or what is statistically common. But that doesn't mean that it is, let's say, healthy. Something can be statistically common and quite unhealthy. Like, he doesn't give, of course, this example, but that makes me think of, for example, our usage of cell phones. it is very, very statistically common for us to abuse of our cell phones for watching videos, for going on the internet, and so on and so forth. But is it healthy? The answer is no. And in the same way, if someone only has 1 hour a day of using their cell phones, it is an anomaly in this day and age, but it is healthy. So it's also very interesting to see that the two can decorrelate one from the other and can be very, very different in mind and in perspective. And he goes into a lot of medical history, going from basically Claude Bernard to Le Riche and Auguste Comte, which are basically famous French people. And he tries to explain that this positivity in medicine is partly a mistake, and that fundamentally what we should do as clinicians is to put down the clinic rather than the mass of fairies. Interestingly enough, he points out to something that is also quite intriguing, that most of the things medicine discovers is through accident, and this is very true. Most of the disorders we know of and we've explored because we've had cases of people where certain functions, like for example brain functions, have not been there, and we've been able to deduce what was the brain function because the person had a damaged brain part, right? So very interestingly enough, he points out that medicine often just explores and finds things at random, and through this randomness creates fairy. And he also adheres to the perspective of Le Riche, which was a doctor that said that basically normality is the silence of the organs, which means that normality is basically not being in pain, which circles back to what I was saying, that what is pathological is what makes us hurt, and what states that we want to change, states that cannot be integrated in our norm, and states that basically we can't deal with. And that's what medicine should try to solve, states that we basically can't cope with. And at the very core, one should never forget the clinic, rather than trying to, how can I say, create a fairy or have the fairy dictate what should happen. In a way, science should be a guide, but not a master, meaning that it shouldn't override the observations of the clinician, and I found that to be very interesting. In any case, this book, I would highly recommend it. It's a hard read, right? I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's quite a hard read because it's medical examples, and it's not necessarily going to explain the medical terms. Like if you don't know what glucosuria is, it's going to be complicated to not whip out your cell phone and Google it. And he also has some neologisms, i.e. he creates certain words at certain points. Very interesting, however, and I would highly recommend it if you're in the mood for some, how can I say, hard medical philosophy, but nevertheless, highly interesting. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one.